Hey, my name is, ow! My name is Dawson, and today I'm going to show you how I transformed my kitchen on a tiny budget by painting on a backsplash, building this floating shelf, and doing a quick little update to the pantry. So follow along and let's get started. The previous owner of the home was a flipper, and in the kitchen, I think they removed the original base cabinets and the countertops, but they didn't remove the original tile floor, probably because it's a horrific nightmare to remove tile. But when they put the new cabinets in, they wanted them to be a different layout than the original ones. But the floors were already made for that original layout, and so now some of the cabinets are kind of weird and have these gaps on the floor next to the floors and the cabinets, and it's just really not looking good. Eventually, I would love to replace these floors. I don't know if you can really tell in the video, but there's this really weird black checkered pattern in the middle of the room, and they are really in bad shape. So when I take out these floors, I have to remove all the cabinets, and I might as well do a complete kitchen renovation at that point. But today, I'm gonna show you how I redid the kitchen for a small, tiny budget. So I came up with a plan to give this space a new life without breaking the bank. I'm gonna remove these two upper cabinets by the sink and replace them with a floating shelf. Right now, there's also not really a great place for the trash cans in the kitchen, so I'm thinking I might figure out a way to adjust the pantry shelves so that I could put it in there. Then to finish everything off, I'm going to paint on a backsplash. Tiling a backsplash really isn't too difficult, but especially if this isn't a permanent fix to the kitchen, it just really doesn't make sense to tile the wall. So I'm going to just paint it on because it's so much cheaper and I think faster too. To start with this project, I needed to take down the two kitchen cabinets. The bottom cabinets have all been replaced, but these upper ones are definitely original. They match exactly with the cabinets next to my fireplace, and let me tell you, it was not easy to remove these. I'm gonna start taking off the cabinet by removing this little piece of trim that goes all the way around it. I'm starting to think that it might just be built piece by piece into the wall because I don't see a single screw. I think this might be a little harder than I thought at first, but not impossible. We can do it. That trim is not doing anything structural, but it did make it a little bit more locked into the wall. So I just figured this would be easier to take off the cabinet if I took this piece of trim off too. To do that, I did my mini trim puller and a rubber mallet. And like every project I've ever done, this fought me every step of the way. So what's weird about these cabinets though, is that normally cabinets are attached to the wall with screws, but this one was nailed in. It's just like coming off. I've never seen that before, and I ended up just taking my trim puller and kind of putting it behind the cabinet, and it practically just pried it off of the wall. And I guess that was on there enough, but it still was kind of spooky to me that I was able to pull it off that easily. Yay! Wait, where did I put this? It literally already feels like 20 times bigger in here. And it's kind of scary that it was only held up with like 4 nails. I feel like that's scary. I don't know. So I ended up repeating that process on the second cabinet, which that one fell a lot faster than I was ready for. And when I took these cabinets off, unfortunately, I realized it looks like I was gonna have to do a little bit of drywall work in here. The walls under the cabinets have a texture, and then someone along the way smoothed out the rest of the wall. But I totally lucked out because this part has popcorn texture and it also had it under the cabinet, so at least that will match. And then one day I'm gonna scrape all that off, but we'll see when that happens. So to fix all this texture, I'm gonna do a process called skim coating. And this is actually something that I was really nervous about the first time I ever did it. But honestly, after the unthinkable amount of drywall work I had to do in the garage, these two little patches of skim coating just seemed like a piece of cake to me now. And I think you could totally do it too. So here's how I did it. When you skim coat a wall, basically you are going to need some joint compound and a taping knife. Joint compound is kind of like a Play-Doh pancake batter. It's a really weird consistency, and I always like to mix in a little bit of water just to make it a little bit smoother and easier to put onto the wall. Now, I'm not honestly very good at this process, but here's what I do. I first start on getting the joint compound just on the wall, and it's not gonna look very good when you first start. It does when professionals do it, but for me, it just does not look very good. But after I get everything kind of on the wall for that first layer, I go back with my taping knife and try to smooth it all out. And you'll actually be surprised that you don't need to press that hard when you're trying to get it smooth. You will have to do this process though a couple times, so don't worry if you don't have amazing coverage on that first coat and you're still seeing some of the texture through it. You can definitely fix that in the next few coats. I also like to point a fan at the joint compound to kind of help it dry quicker. Now, after that first coat dries, I go back and I scrape off any big bumps and ridges and then repeat this process. This second coat will be so much easier to do because the texture will have been mostly covered up by now and the taping knife just smooths it out way more easily. I do some sanding though in between the second coat and the third coat just to make sure that the wall is really smooth. And this sanding process is quite messy, so I do try to hold up my vacuum near where I'm sanding so it just sucks up a lot of that dust before it falls onto the ground. I ended up doing 3 coats of joint compound before I felt like that patch looked really good. Now, one thing I hope you learned from this video is that you must prime your skim coat patch before painting. If you don't and you just start painting over it, eventually most of that paint will just flake off, especially if the wall ever gets scratched or something like that. So make sure you do the primer step. You will not regret it. After that coat of primer and paint, this wall looks perfect and ready for the next step, which is my backsplash. Now, like I mentioned before, this is not a permanent project, so don't freak out when I show you the pattern, but I went with this off the wall kind of bold pattern that I designed. I was inspired by some funky curvy tiles that I saw, and I think it just brings so much energy into the room. I drew the pattern on my laptop with Adobe Illustrator, but I was kind of struggling with how to make it actually come to life on my wall. Now, this might surprise you, but after a little brainstorming, I ended up using plastic school folders to make it happen. Now, here's what I did. So my design looks pretty complicated, but it's actually just a couple shapes. The base layer is a grid of squares, and then inside each square is either a circle, triangle, or rectangle, or some combo of that, repeated and flipped in multiple ways. So my theory was that if I could just get this handful of primary shapes cut out onto a template, then I could use that template to trace my design onto the wall. But I needed those shapes to be the exact size to fit the wall. So to do this, I used my Cricut machine to cut out those shapes to be the precise right size that I needed. Now, I didn't know this, and maybe you do. My Cricut machine though can actually cut plastic folders, which was perfect because the plastic folder was just hard enough that I could use it as a really reliable template. If I had used paper, it might have been a little bent or something like that when I put my pencil up against it. So I got all my shapes cut out, and then I started putting my design on the wall. I held them up mostly with my hand and then did some green tape to kind of hold things in place. And this part did take quite a bit of time to complete because I just wanted to make sure I didn't mess up the pattern in any way, and it would be pretty easy to accidentally draw the pattern in the wrong way. But after drawing it all out, I put little pieces of tape on each part of the design that I needed to paint. Otherwise, this is kind of complicated and I could totally see myself painting the wrong section by accident. So at this point, it was kind of like a paint by numbers. And I know that painting stresses some people out, but I find this to be so therapeutic. I just put on a good playlist and went to work painting this on by hand. All the curvy parts I had to do just freehand, but then I did use green painter's tape to get a really crisp line on all those straight edges. It did take me a couple hours to do, but once I got started, I really couldn't stop, and it was so much fun. I'm blown away with how good this looks just a little bit of paint later, and this feels like a completely new kitchen. And the best part is I probably spent maybe like $30 on this whole backsplash project so far. So I think that was totally worth it for $30. So the pantry, like I mentioned, one day is something that I would like to rip out because it's just weird to me to have a whole huge door inside of my tiny kitchen. And I'd rather just have a pantry that looks like it's part of the cabinets. So to make this look better, I decided that I was gonna just go ahead and give it a coat of paint. But as soon as I cleared out all of my food and got the shelves out, I realized that the shelves were in really bad shape. They were all covered in a contact paper, so I ripped that off, and then I realized that the wood was really gross and disgusting. And even after trying to sand it a little bit, they were still super nasty and really sticky. So I ended up deciding to rebuild these shelves because it just didn't make sense to me to save them at this point. They were so gross, and I ended up ripping out all the old supports so that I could just start fresh and build something new. Unfortunately, ripping out those old supports did leave a little bit of damage, and I had to repair that, and I just used spackle to do that versus joint compound like I did on the other parts of the wall. So after all that was fixed, I painted the pantry this awesome olive green color. I love that when I will open up the pantry now, it'll be a kind of fun little surprise. And after that dried, I ended up adding in some new supports for the shelves. I did kind of the same structural plan that the old shelves were with, and then I painted painted everything that same color as the walls so that those supports would just blend in. For the actual shelf part though, I wanted to do something that would kind of stand out against that green. So I got some leftover plywood from another project and ripped it down to the size of my shelves. I put edge banding on the front of that shelf so it would look like a real piece of wood versus plywood. I did a little bit of sanding just to make sure everything was smooth, and then I used Danish oil to stain it. I love Danish oil because it's really beginner friendly to use. My dad used to use this all the time with his junior high woodshop teachers, and I just love that this color looks perfect against those green walls. I did decide to put one less shelf in here so I could fit the trash can and recycling on the ground, and I'm really glad that I don't have to look at those from my bedroom anymore. Now this part of the project was a little bit ridiculous. Obviously, like, the pantry is not that big of a deal, but I like it a lot more now, and I think it'll be a good fix in the meantime until I redo the kitchen. So to finish off this whole kitchen saga, I wanted to build a floating shelf. Now to keep costs down, I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea to use a $20 piece of pine with some shelf brackets to make a really chunky shelf, and here's how it went. In theory, this was a great idea because this was super cheap and would look great, but per usual, I cannot stain anything to save my life, and I totally messed this up. After sanding and putting some pre-stained conditioner on the wood, I thought it would be cool to try whitewashing the wood before doing my final stain just to lighten everything up in the end. I've seen other people do something similar, but I was totally wrong about this. I'm still not exactly sure what I did wrong here, but the whitewash ended up creating this really glossy, thick coating on the wood, and when I tried to put the stain on top of that, it was just a complete and embarrassing disaster. So there was absolutely no part of me that could attempt to even sand this down again, so I just decided to take the $20 loss and start over. For the second round, when I built the shelf, I decided to switch things up and build the shelf kind of like what I've seen the pros do. Now, really nice floating shelves usually have an inner frame and then a plywood kind of cover that slides over that frame. So let me show you first how I built that cover. To build this, I needed a top piece, a bottom piece, and a little small piece that would go in between the two and make it look like one whole big chunky piece of wood. So to do this, I set up my table saw and I put the blade at a 45-degree angle. And then I cut this 1/2 inch sheet of plywood down to the width I needed for the top and bottom pieces. You'll only need a 45-degree angle on the front edge of that shelf. The back edge that touches the wall can just be a normal, regular straight cut. For the small piece of wood that goes in between that top and bottom, I cut both edges at a 45-degree angle. Since one edge of my shelf was going to be touching that pantry wall, the other end is going to be shown in the dining room, and you will totally see it because it's not anchored to a wall or anything like that. So for this side, I also needed to make beveled cuts, but I don't have like a big compound miter saw, which you would need to do this. So I ended up using my circular saw set at a 45-degree angle to make the cuts on the end of my board. After everything was cut, it was time to move on to gluing. This is my favorite part of the process, and I promise if you're confused at this point, it's about to make so much sense when you see this all get glued together. So I ended up putting painter's tape on the ground, and I lined up all of my pieces so the beveled cuts would touch each other. And you want to try to make sure that you get these seams as tight as possible. The next step is to put wood glue in those cracks, and I just used a little rubber brush to spread that wood glue out everywhere. You want to make sure you get really good coverage with the glue. After you spread that all out, you essentially just kind of fold these pieces up like you're closing a book. The tape will hold it all together while the glue dries, but I did end up putting a couple pieces of tape as an extra barrier of strength just to make sure it held it all together. And then you want to make sure you put a piece of wood in that back of the shelf to kind of hold the shape correctly while it dries. And that piece I'm putting in the back is the same thickness that my frame will be. For the open end of the shelf that will be seen in the dining room, I had to glue in a little piece of wood here that was beveled on all three sides, top, bottom, and front. This little piece was a kind of bit tricky to glue in here, but I actually think it turned out pretty good. I let this dry overnight and then came back and removed all the pieces of tape. I was really nervous to peel all this tape off because it was my first time doing this, and I was nervous that maybe some of the seams had come apart while it was drying or something like that. But much to my surprise, the shape held perfect and the seams seams looked really, really good. There was a little bit of glue that got out from the seams and was on the top and the front and the bottom of the shelf. So I needed to sand that off before I could stain it. And this is where things unfortunately started to go really downhill with this second shelf. I got my sander out and I put it on a really low setting because I knew I was sanding plywood and I didn't want to burn through the veneer. I've sanded plywood before and I've done this a couple times, so I wasn't too nervous about it. But much to my surprise, apparently I bought something called blonde wood, which is not really great for sanding or staining because it's like a really thin veneer. And I didn't know that I had done that. So unfortunately, I burned through a couple places where I was sanding the glue off, and there's no way to come back from this. You cannot fix it because it's like this cheap plywood. So I had to just cut my losses and start all over again. The only other alternative would have been to paint it, and I just really didn't want that look. So I repeated the same process again with a hardier birch plywood, and I think it turned out even better. My seams were tighter, my cuts were cleaner, and I'm really proud of how this one turned out. When it came time to stain, I did drop the entire bottle of Danish oil all over the shelf, which made a huge mess.
Oh my gosh.
But like I told you, I'm not good at staining, so none of this was surprising to me at this point. Once that was all finished and dried up, it was time to attach my shelf to the wall. I built a frame out of 2-inch pine boards and screwed those into the studs. I used those same type of screws that you would use to hang up a cabinet with, and after I got that frame onto the wall, which let me tell you was a little bit hard to do solo, I just slide on this cover that I made for the shelf onto the frame, and it looks perfect. Now, it's probably a good idea to kind of screw that shelf into the frame, but I will be super real with y'all. Because the shelf is really long and only anchored on the back wall and the side, I don't know why, but it's kind of drooping. So I might have to take this down and make some adjustments in the future. So if you have any suggestions on how to do that, let me know in the comments. But I decided not to screw that shelf cover into the frame just yet, just in case I have to take it off. Now, I've put all of my plates, cups, and everything back and all my decorations, and I just cannot believe how good this kitchen looks. I can't believe how much of a difference a few simple and cheap DIYs made, and I think my favorite change in here is probably the backsplash. I love just how much energy it brings into the space, and I can't believe it only cost about $30 to do. I don't know how to quite describe it, but the floating shelf just provides so much storage that the cabinets had, but it somehow simultaneously makes the room feel bigger, which I don't know how is possible, and that's a major need in this small gallery kitchen. I want to make it feel as big as possible. One of my favorite things though about this kitchen redesign is that from the living room, you can kind of get a glimpse of this kitchen through the big archway, and I really like that the curve of the arch plays nicely with the curves and shapes in the backsplash, and I think it just works really well together. Eventually, I'm gonna do a really big remodel in my kitchen, taking out all the cabinets and removing the soffits and all of that, but I think this was a really fun update that made it just feel like a completely new space without breaking the bank. So let me know what you think in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe for more DIY projects. I'll see you next time.